Hi, Misha here, and been trying to kind of catch up on a lot of the American aircraft, but not really going in any particular order. I recently put out a couple of videos on the Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II. So with that, I decided why not cover the original Lightning, Lockheed's P-38. And I have two models here, both 1/72 scale diecast. This one is from JC Wings. And it's of a P-38L long-range fighter, as used in the Pacific. And over here we have the F-5E photo reconnaissance variant, used in Europe, and this model is from Corgi, and actually a pretty recent release. The P-38 was a so-called heavy fighter. It was a twin-engine design, as you know, at a time when the U.S. Army Air Corps, later U.S. Army Air Forces, really was stuck on single-engine designs. First flew in 1939. And it's actually the only fighter to be produced throughout America's entire involvement in World War II. And it would be officially retired in 1949. There's some very good and some not so good about this plane, including a relatively protracted development cycle. So with that, we will get right into it. Work would begin on the P-38 in 1937. That year, in February, the U.S. Army Air Corps released requirements for a new high-speed, high-altitude, twin-engine Interceptor. And they very intentionally used the word Interceptor, not fighter or patrol for the P series, because at that time a group in the Air Corps known as the Fighter Mafia had a thing about lightweight fighters. They needed to have one engine only, and they could only have about 500 pounds in armament. Just, the thoughts of the day. So to kind of get around this, they called this an Interceptor. It needed to reach at least 360 miles per hour and be able to climb to altitude of at least 20,000 feet rapidly. And it would need to have a liquid-cooled Allison engine. Well, Lockheed got to work. Kelly Johnson was a senior member of the design team, and they came up with this very unique nacelle twin boom pattern that's pretty iconic for the P-38. Very unique looking plane. It was also an all metal skinned plane, had a tricycle landing gear, and very early on they decided to kind of focus all of the armament in the nose, which a lot of aircraft at the time split the armament either amongst the wings or the wings and the nose. Didn't take long. By June, the Lockheed design was selected and the Air Corps ordered one XP-38 prototype. And from there, advanced work would begin on the design, and the following year, work would begin on the prototype. Even before the prototype first flew, which it did in January of 1939, the Air Corps ordered 13 YP-38 prototypes. And then, a short time after the prototype flew, they ordered 66 P-38 production models. While the first flight went well in January, then in February, it was decided to kind of make a publicity stunt and fly the XP-38 from California to New York in February of 1939, and it made it to New York, but it crashed before reaching its final destination, destroying the prototype. However, it did set a record of just over 7 hours coast to coast in America, which did gain the program a lot of publicity, even though the prototype was trashed. This was pretty heavily criticized as putting a stunt before practical engineering, and it's hard to deny that. And the work would continue. It actually took quite a while to get the YP-38s up and running. Lockheed really had to figure out how to make this plane. They had been a relatively small factory. They had to upscale. They also had to figure out how to make a modern fighter. It just took a lot of time to get production up and running. To that end, the first YP-38 really didn't fly until September of 1940, and the last one was delivered in June of 1941. Now, by November of that year, they would pretty much have all their manufacturing ironed out and be starting to crank these out. That initial order of 66, well, they ended up getting divided into two groups. You have the original P-38A, of which 30 were made, and then you have an upgraded version, 36, the remaining part of the batch, designated as the P-38D. So no B, no C. We jump from A to D. Now there are some changes between the original prototype, the Ys, and the productions, mostly having to do with lightening up the design, streamlining for mass production, refining the armament. Early on they considered having 2 50 cal machine guns, 2 30 cal machine guns, and a cannon. Eventually they would settle upon 4 50 cal machine guns and 1 cannon, again all on the nose. They would also tinker with the propellers. They would change the direction of the rotation, and just to point out, the propellers on these are actually counter-rotating to help prevent torque. But it was not without incident. There were just several issues with this plane, not to go into here, but of course the big one everyone knows about is compressibility. Back then they thought it was tail flutter because the Air Corps, later renamed Army Air Forces in 1941, had more experience with wood and canvas planes, and they just didn't understand, hey, this is metal, so flutter is probably not happening. But anyway, they insisted it was flutter. It basically meant once the plane had got close to Mach 0.7, it would go into uncontrolled dive, and the controls would lock up, and it was very dangerous. In fact, a test pilot was killed in November of 1941. A lot of testing was done. Long story short, they discovered it was just kind of inherent in going so fast. This was the first military fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. It also carried 1,000 pounds in armament with all of its guns and ammunition. Had actually a pretty impressive front-end attack. 2 engines meant it had the extra durability. It could fly on 1 engine, although earlier models had more trouble with this than later ones. Another thing they began working on early on, but for some reason it received kind of pushback, were drop tanks, the ability to use fuel tanks. Some in the Air Force, again, just didn't like this idea. But the U.S. needed a heavy, long-range fighter, so drop tank work commenced. And then, of course, after Pearl Harbor, it was pretty much a non-issue. Speaking of which, You know, by September, October, the U.S. military had about 65, 70 of these in service, and by December, the number was rapidly rising. In 1942, the first drop tank models were moving over to the F now. Now, the F was not made from the factory to take drop tanks, but it could be modified with wet hard points. And that summer, 1942, P-38s began flying from the U.S. to England, and they would stop over in Canada, Greenland, Iceland to refuel, but they did this to avoid U-boats. And this would be the first time a military fighter would cross the Atlantic under its own power. And over 200 were sent to England in this manner, safe and sound. And of course it would continue on from there. By the P-38G model, drop tanks would be a standard feature, or standard option, I should say. And they would very soon introduce a reconnaissance version, known as the F-4, this plane's predecessor, which would have cameras, and its long range and payload would be taken advantage of, although the F-4 and F-5s would never be, well, except for a couple of prototypes, never be armed. So it took a little while to get this up and running, and at the beginning production was slow, but by 1942 it was ramping up. On the other hand, this is a design from the not so late 1930s, and as many planes from that era, it was already starting to look a little obsolete. However, it was not useless. Well, that took longer than expected. I was pausing to get kind of my next part in order, and then I noticed one of the front cannon had fallen off. Stuck it back on and realized it was pretty loose, so decided I needed to glue it. But man, you just needed a tiny dot of glue, and it didn't overflow too much, but there's a little that did come out, so tomorrow I'll have to take it off. The joys of models. Anywho, despite the early issues, mainly the compression thing, right after Pearl Harbor, the first P-38s were used on the west coast of America to provide air defense. And then in 1942, they started to be stationed overseas. They were first sent over to Australia, also up to Alaska, and they started to be flown out of Iceland and eventually the UK throughout 1942. The first kills occurred in August. On August 9th, a couple of Japanese flying boats were shot down by a pair of P-38s coming back from a 1,000-mile long-range patrol. And then a week later, a P-38 out of Iceland shot down a Focke-Wulf FW-200, which was the first American kill in the European theater, and the first German shot down. So this would continue, and then that fall, P-38s would start to be transferred to North Africa in preparation for Operation Torch, and they would enter combat in November of that year and shoot down their first Italian plane. Initially, they were used for long-range patrol and bomber escort. Also, they were sometimes deployed for light ground attack duties. But results in Europe were pretty mixed to negative. A lot of it had to do with tactics. In 1942 and early 43, the Army Air Forces insisted that escort fighters stick very close to their bombers. Then in February of 43, they finally kind of gave them free rein to sweep ahead or intercept or interdict, and things improved. However, while the P-38 was very fast for the late 1930s, by 1943, it was being outpaced by newer Messerschmitt models, and definitely the Focke-Wulf FW-190. As a result, honestly, its escort duties were pretty limited. They made do. The long range was nice, and having two engines, the fact that it could take a beating, and the fact that all of its armament was right in the nose was good. It could deliver a punch and take a punch, but it just didn't have the maneuverability and the speed. Therefore, by 1944, they started to use these more and more in Europe for ground attack and eventually close air support. And by September, they were totally out of use as an escort fighter. But they'd already been, being phased out in favor of the P-47 and P-51 months earlier. They would continue to be used in Europe through the progression of retaking France and marching on Berlin. But really, the P-38 came into its own in the Pacific. Its external fuel tanks, two engines, long-range abilities were just awesome for the Pacific. The long-range patrol, and they would also be used to escort bombers. But the Pacific theater was kind of a second fiddle to Europe, so it took a little longer for P-38s to appear there in numbers. It wasn't until late 1942, early 1943, that they really started to have these in numbers. Really, in April of that year, 16 of these would take part in one of the most famous P-38 missions, where they would be sent to intercept Admiral Yamamoto's Betty bomber and shoot him down, killing him, thus delivering a very major blow to the Japanese military, both tactically, strategically, and really hurting morale. They would continue to be used. They did well against Japanese Zeros. They didn't have quite the turning and maneuverability of a Zero, but they had better climb, and they had a better top speed. And again, having all those guns right in the nose, they could really get out on the Zero and just wallop it. So if they could get a beat on a Zero, and of course by 1943 and 1944, newer versions of the P-38 were better, whereas the Zeros, the A6Ms, were falling further and further behind. So kind of an opposite story of the European theater. So whereas this was kind of quickly relegated to other rows, such as this one over here we'll talk about in just a minute, in Europe, the P-38 remained a very popular mount in the Pacific all the way. He was just a better fighter suited to that theater. And, it wasn't, it was definitely better than a P-40, and it had some aspects that were better than the P-47, and really the P-51 Mustang did not appear in the Pacific till very late in the war, 1945. Even then, the ability for the long range and ability to carry rockets or bombs on the P-38, these are all things that were well liked and respected. So that's why today this is more commonly famous for its use in the Pacific theater. And there were some variations and upgrades of the P-38 throughout its life. So let's get to those. As I said earlier, this is the F-5E. This is the photo reconnaissance version. It has 4 cameras. They even played around with the notion of doing a 2-seat version. There's plenty of room in the center nacelle for that. There's a ton of variations, especially early on, of the Lightning. Like I said, the original P-38 or P-38A, they only made 30 of. Then the P-38D, they made 36 of, and the major updates to it were self-sealing fuel tanks and added armor, especially around the cockpit. The E came next, because alphabet, and it was really when the kind of the final armament was selected. They had played around with a few different things, and they would settle on 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns. They could have 300 to 500 rounds per machine gun. Also 20 millimeter cannon with 150 shells. So pretty impressive. Interestingly, the machine guns, their muzzles are staggered for feeding purposes. The first true fully combat capable version was the P-38F, which is also the first version that could be fitted with drop tanks, although not from the factory. The G and H were further improvements, better fighter versions. The P-38J was one of the first to be produced in truly large numbers. It had an improved electrical system, improved cooling system, better flaps. And it was the J towards the end of its production block where they would actually introduce the high-speed automatic flaps in late 1943. They would really kind of solve the compressibility issue, at least most of it away. And then the final major version was the P-38L, which introduced new rocket racks and had improved engines and other little tweaks. There was also the P-38M, which were a few, only about 75 that were converted to night fighters with radar. The first photo reconnaissance version was the F-4, and it first went into use in 1942 in Australia. It would have F-4A, F-4B, and they pretty much either be conversions of standard models or just the photo reconnaissance version of that model, so I'm not going to get into the differences. That gave way to this here, the F-5, which again they had several variants of, really just analogous to the, P-38G, H, J, L, so on and so forth. And this particular model from Corgi is patterned after the ones flown on D-Day, but these were actually very popular in Europe. Again, it was a relatively stable platform, had a very good long range. It was capable of good altitude and reasonable speed for that purpose. So, where it wasn't a great fighter in Europe, it was actually a good reconnaissance plane. And because of the body, the way it's set up, it actually allowed for pretty good arcs and variations in camera. But yeah, just some basic specs. It's a little under 38 feet long with a 52-foot wingspan, max speed of about 410 to 415 miles per hour. Pretty good altitude. It could get up to nearly 45,000 feet. As I already said, it had 4 machine guns and a cannon in the nose as standard. It had both inner and outer hardpoints. The inner hardpoints were plumbed, meaning they could have drop tanks. They could carry bombs instead. The outer hardpoints could carry rockets or smaller bombs. And for a fighter, it actually had a pretty good lift capability for World War II. By the end of World War II, these are still in production and service, but the last contracts were canceled, meaning just over 10,000 P-38 Lightnings were produced. The name Lightning actually came from Britain, who along with France placed an order in 1940, although most were never delivered. But yeah, they designated it as Lightning and it just kind of stuck. So there you go. While production would be halted with the war, service would continue for a few more years. When the U.S. Army Air Forces became the U.S. Air Force in 1947, these were still in inventory but were quickly designated Z P-38 for obsolescence. And then were finally officially retired out of service. At least the few J's and L models, or earlier models, were long gone. They were officially retired in 1949. So, you know, like most World War II airplanes, they didn't much live the war. And interestingly, they didn't quite make it to Korea like the P-51. But considering this design dated all the way back to 1937, it's not at all a shameful thing. Well, this video has really gone on long enough, and, you know, models being models. But just a brief talk. I do like the Herpa in the sense that it's pretty much all metal, including the tail. It has optional drop tanks, gear up or down. The Corgi has gear up or down, but of course does not have ordnance or guns because it's a photo reconnaissance. It's a little more plastic. The rear is plastic. And typically Corgi is pretty good about doing metal, but with the split tail planes like this, or the Vampire, they say they like to keep the tails lighter to keep it balanced on the stand, which I can appreciate. Even though it's more plastic, it actually feels a little solid, more solid, chunkier than the JC wings. I think I called it Herpa a minute ago. I do apologize. JC wings. And it definitely comes with a pretty nice stand. Corgi always does a good job with the stands. The JC is essentially an upgrade of the old Witty tooling. And so it has the old Witty stand, which is sufficient, but a little wobbly. I'm not going to lie. I have a feeling this one's going to tump over a few times. And whereas the Corgi comes with the pitot tubes and other little doodads and whatnot installed already, the JC does not. You have to install the front cannon, the pitot tubes in the back, the one under the wing. Now, of course, the drop tanks you put on, but that's understandable. But I do wish that they would install the little bits, because some of them, they're tiny. That cannon especially is really hard to get in because of having the other two cannon there, or machine guns rather. The other parts not so much, but the ones on the tail are a little fiddly. It's hard to keep them in. But what can you do? Still, it's neat, and to date, Corgi doesn't have a P-38 Lightning fighter. They just have this F-5, which really just came out October of 2019. I also have an Atlas P-38 that I've had for some time. Maybe I'll do a comparison video at one point. But yeah, appreciate you tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.